Elias Greenfield stared at the preliminary deed transfer papers scattered across his kitchen table, each page bearing his wife's signature in blue ink. The documents had been tucked between grocery store circulars and credit card offers, hidden in plain sight. Moira's handwriting was careful, deliberate. She'd signed away their house to her brother Caleb 3 days ago. Tax purposes, she'd said over coffee that morning, not looking up from her phone. Caleb thinks we can save money if the property's under his company name temporarily. Temporarily. The word had stuck in Elias's throat like a bone. Now, sitting alone in the silence of their Cleveland home while Moira worked late again, he studied every line of the documents. The transfer wasn't temporary. It was permanent. Their house, the one he'd been making payments on for 12 years, would belong to Caleb's LLC by month's end. Elias set the papers down and walked to the basement. The old boiler hummed in the corner, its steady rhythm a comfort after 16 years of industrial repair work. He understood systems that operated under pressure. He understood when something was about to blow. His phone buzzed. A text from Moira. "Working late again? Don't wait up." The same message she'd sent 3 times this week. The same message that preceded her arriving home at 1 a.m. with the smell of expensive cologne clinging to her clothes. Elias climbed the stairs and stood in their bedroom doorway. Everything looked normal. Their bed with the blue comforter, her vanity cluttered with makeup, his work clothes folded on the dresser. But something felt wrong. The air itself seemed charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. He'd learned to trust that feeling. In his line of work, ignoring instinct could mean third-degree burns or worse. The next morning, Elias arrived at the Riverside Apartments conversion project, a former steel mill turned into overpriced housing for young professionals. The irony wasn't lost on him. He spent his days keeping rich people warm in buildings where his grandfather had once forged steel. "You look like heck," Theo called from across the boiler room. His co-worker had worked the industrial circuit for 25 years, his arms mapped with scars from steam burns and electrical accidents. Didn't sleep much. Elias pulled on his work gloves and approached the main furnace system. Something was off about the pressure readings. Marriage troubles? Theo's voice carried the weight of a man who'd been divorced twice. Something like that. Elias checked the gauges again. The pressure was running hot, too hot for a system that should have been stable. "Let me give you some advice," Theo said, wrench in hand. "When a woman starts acting different, starts making decisions without you, that's not marriage trouble. That's war, and in war, the side that strikes first usually wins." Elias was about to respond when the main valve erupted. The explosion threw him backward 10 feet, his body slamming into a concrete wall. Steam filled the room like a white fog, and somewhere through the hiss and chaos, he heard Theo screaming his name. The emergency sirens wailed as plant security rushed in. Elias lay on the cold floor, his left arm burned and his vision blurry. The last thing he remembered before the paramedics arrived was Theo kneeling beside him, saying something about the valve being rigged. "This wasn't an accident, Eli. Someone wanted you dead." The words followed him into unconsciousness. Elias spent 2 days in Cleveland General Hospital. The burns on his arm were second degree but manageable. The concussion would heal. What wouldn't heal was the knowledge that someone had tried to kill him. Moira came to visit once, bringing flowers and wearing the perfume he'd bought her for Christmas. She stayed for 20 minutes, checked her phone 6 times, and left claiming she had an important meeting. "I'm glad you're okay," she'd said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Caleb sends his love." Theo visited that evening, bringing coffee and answers. "I went back and checked the system," he said, settling into the visitor's chair. "Someone tampered with the pressure release valve. Whoever did it knew exactly how to make it look like equipment failure. Who has access to the boiler room? Building management, contractors, maintenance staff, maybe a dozen people." Theo paused. "But here's the thing. Whoever did this knew you'd be the one checking that specific system. Your work schedule isn't exactly public information." Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this was personal. Someone wanted you out of the picture and they knew your routine well enough to set the trap." That night, Elias lay in his hospital bed staring at the ceiling tiles. Moira's signature on the deed papers. Her late nights and evasive answers. The attempted murder disguised as an industrial accident. The pieces were forming a picture he didn't want to see. When he was released from the hospital, Elias returned to find his house feeling different. Smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer together in his absence. Moira greeted him with unusual enthusiasm, cooking his favorite dinner and asking detailed questions about his injuries. "The doctor said you were lucky," she said, refilling his water glass. "If you'd been standing 2 feet closer to that valve." She didn't finish the sentence, but her tone suggested relief rather than concern. That night, unable to sleep, Elias went to his workshop in the basement. He needed to think, and he'd always thought best with his hands busy. As he organized his tools, his eyes fell on an old electrical outlet near the workbench, one he'd never noticed before. The outlet was newer than the others, its faceplate cleaner. He unscrewed it from the wall and found something that made his blood freeze. A tiny camera lens, no bigger than a pinhead, embedded in the fake outlet cover. Someone had been watching him, recording his movements, his schedule, his habits. Learning when he'd be in the boiler room, when he'd check the pressure systems, when he'd be in exactly the right position for an accident. Elias stared at the device in his palm. Such a small thing to represent such a massive betrayal. He thought about Moira's questions at dinner, her sudden interest in his recovery. She wasn't concerned about his health. She was confirming that her plan had failed. For the first time in 16 years of marriage, Elias Greenfield smiled with genuine satisfaction. His wife had tried to kill him for his life insurance and the house. She'd failed, and now she had no idea that he knew. The game had begun, and Moira didn't even realize she was playing. Over the next week, Elias returned to work part-time while his arm healed. He told no one about the camera, not even Theo. Instead, he watched and listened, gathering information like a man preparing for war. He learned that Caleb's LLC, Brantley Holdings, had been quietly acquiring properties throughout their neighborhood. He learned that Moira had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on him 6 months ago. He learned that her late meetings coincided perfectly with the schedule of Kellen Dorsey, the hospital's chief operating officer, Kellen Dorsey. 42 years old, divorced, drives a silver BMW, lives in a downtown condo that costs more than most people's annual salary. Elias had met him twice at hospital fundraising events, a glad-handing corporate type who spoke in buzzwords and treated service workers like furniture, the kind of man who would sleep with another man's wife and call it networking. Elias began making his own preparations. He rented a storage unit across town under a false name, paying cash for 6 months in advance. He purchased a used pickup truck from a private seller, registering it under the same fake identity. He installed GPS spoofing software on his phone, technology he'd learned about from younger technicians who used it to fake their locations for dating apps. Most importantly, he found his sanctuary. The old Riverside steel mill had been partially demolished before the apartment conversion project began. One section remained untouched, a massive boiler room deep in the building's foundation. The city had condemned it as too expensive to renovate, but Elias had the access codes and the knowledge to make it functional. He spent 3 evenings converting the space into his operational headquarters. Emergency lighting, secure storage, communication equipment, and most importantly, complete privacy. No cameras here, except the ones he installed. From his hidden base, Elias began systematic surveillance of his wife and her lover. Moira's routine was predictable. Monday through Wednesday, she worked late at the hospital, usually returning home around midnight, with alibis about budget meetings and strategic planning sessions. Thursday and Friday were date nights, dinner at expensive restaurants followed by visits to Kellen's downtown condo. Kellen's patterns were even more revealing. The man documented his entire life on social media, posting photos of expensive meals, luxury purchases, and carefully staged, candid moments. His arrogance would be his downfall. But Elias needed more than affairs and fake documents. He needed leverage that would destroy them completely. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Landau, his 78-year-old neighbor. "Your wife has been getting a lot of mail lately," she mentioned while they both collected their newspapers one morning. "Legal-looking envelopes." "I only noticed because the postman keeps mixing up our addresses." That afternoon, Elias intercepted the mail delivery. Among the usual bills and advertisements was a letter from Harrington, Pierce and Associates, Caleb's law firm. The return address made his pulse quicken. Inside the envelope were finalized divorce papers, filed but not yet served. Moira had already retained counsel and was seeking dissolution of their marriage on grounds of irreconcilable differences. She was asking for half of all assets, full custody of their 16-year-old daughter Rowan, and spousal support. The kicker: she'd backdated the separation agreement to make it appear they'd been living apart for months, which would void any claims he might have to assets acquired during that period, including the life insurance policy. She'd planned everything perfectly, except for one detail. Elias was supposed to be dead. That evening, Elias sat across from his daughter at the dinner table, while Moira worked late again. Rowan had inherited her mother's intelligence, but her father's observational skills. She'd been watching the family dynamics with teenage awareness. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Are you and Mom getting divorced?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Elias studied his daughter's face, concerned but not surprised. "Why would you ask that?" "She's been acting weird. Hiding phone calls, staying out late, cleaning the house like someone important is coming over." Rowan pushed food around her plate. "Plus, Uncle Caleb has been asking me strange questions about you. Like whether you have any other bank accounts or if you've ever talked about moving away." Smart girl. Too smart for her own good. "Your mother and I are going through some difficulties," Elias said carefully. "But whatever happens, it won't change how much I love you." Rowan nodded, then reached into her backpack. "I found this in Mom's car yesterday." She handed him a crumpled receipt. The paper was from an insurance agency downtown. The service listed was Policy Amendment, Beneficiary Update. The date was 3 days after his accident. Moira had changed the beneficiary on his life insurance policy from Rowan to herself. She wasn't just planning his death. She was ensuring maximum profit from it. That night, after Rowan went to bed, Elias drove to his secret base in the old mill. He had evidence of adultery, insurance fraud, attempted murder, and property theft. Enough to destroy Moira and Kellen in court. But court cases took months. Evidence could be challenged. Lawyers could create doubt. Elias wanted something more immediate, more personal. He wanted them to suffer the way they'd made him suffer, through betrayal, humiliation, and the slow realization that their perfect plan had been turned against them. The first strike came on a Tuesday morning. Kellen Dorsey prided himself on his professional image. His LinkedIn profile boasted about innovative healthcare solutions and patient-centered leadership. He drove to work in his spotless BMW, arrived at precisely 8:30 a.m., and parked in his reserved space near the hospital's main entrance. Which is why the billboard was perfectly positioned for maximum impact. Elias had paid a local advertising company cash to replace a routine healthcare awareness poster with something more personal. The new billboard featured a 20-foot-tall photograph of Kellen's ex-wife in lingerie, a photo leaked from Kellen's own social media archives from 5 years earlier, when they'd been married and she'd modeled for a local photographer. The billboard went live during the morning rush hour, positioned on Interstate 90, where thousands of Cleveland commuters, including Kellen's colleagues, would see it on their way to work. Kellen's phone started ringing at 8:45 a.m. Elias watched from the hospital parking garage as Kellen emerged from his BMW, phone pressed to his ear, face red with rage and embarrassment. By lunchtime, the billboard story had spread through the hospital's gossip network. By evening, it was trending on local social media. The billboard company claimed they'd received the order from someone using Kellen's own corporate credit card information. When Kellen protested, they produced signed authorization documents bearing his forged signature. The message was clear. Someone was playing games, and Kellen was losing. But the billboard was just the opening move. 3 days later, Elias struck at Caleb. His brother-in-law operated his real estate business from a converted storefront in a strip mall, the kind of place that suggested success while revealing its owner's limitations. Caleb specialized in small-time property flips and rental management. Legal enough to avoid prosecution, sleazy enough to maximize profit. Elias knew that Caleb cut corners on his renovations. Unpermitted electrical work, substandard plumbing, building code violations that inspectors somehow missed. The kind of shortcuts that could be catastrophic under the right circumstances. On Thursday evening, after Caleb's office had closed, Elias used his industrial expertise to create a very specific type of accident. Natural gas leaks were common in older buildings, especially ones with DIY plumbing modifications. A slow leak near the water heater, combined with a carefully placed spark from faulty wiring, could create a dramatic but non-lethal explosion. The blast occurred at 11:47 p.m., shattering windows and sending flames shooting through the roof of Caleb's office. The fire department responded within minutes and no one was injured. But the investigation revealed multiple building code violations, unpermitted construction work, and evidence that Caleb had been operating without proper licensing for electrical modifications. The insurance company refused to pay out, citing gross negligence. The city condemned the building and launched a comprehensive audit of all Caleb's properties. The state licensing board opened an investigation into his business practices. By morning, Caleb Brantley was facing bankruptcy, criminal charges, and the dissolution of his real estate empire. Moira was furious. "This isn't a coincidence," she told Elias over breakfast, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Someone is targeting our family." "Who would do that?" Elias asked, perfectly innocent. "I don't know, but when I find out, they're going to regret it." She left for work that morning with the determination of a woman preparing for war. What she didn't know was that the war had already been fought and she'd lost. The charity gala was Moira's idea of strategic networking, an annual hospital fundraiser where Cleveland's medical and business elite gathered to be seen donating money to worthy causes. She'd bought a new dress for the occasion, something black and elegant that cost more than Elias made in a week. Kellen would be there, of course. So would hospital board members, local politicians, and every social climber in the city's medical establishment, which made it the perfect venue for Kellen's next humiliation. Elias arrived at the event dressed as a maintenance worker, complete with clipboard and official-looking credentials. Hospital staff were used to seeing repair technicians at all hours. No one questioned a man checking HVAC systems during a large event. The gala's audio-visual setup was impressive. Multiple screens, professional sound equipment, and a central control booth that managed everything from ambient lighting to presentation slideshows. It took Elias 15 minutes to hack into the system and upload his special presentation. The moment came during Kellen's keynote speech about healthcare innovation and ethical leadership. Halfway through his prepared remarks about patient care and professional standards, the screens throughout the ballroom flickered and changed. Suddenly, every monitor was displaying a carefully edited recording of Kellen on his phone, taken through his condo window the previous week. The audio was crystal clear. "These patients are idiots. Half of them don't need to be here, but we bill their insurance anyway. Yeah, I'm sleeping with someone on staff, but her husband doesn't suspect anything. Guy's a complete moron who spends his day fixing boilers." The recording continued for 90 seconds, featuring Kellen mocking patients, bragging about insurance fraud, and detailing his affair with a married subordinate. Every word was authentic, captured during one of his arrogant phone conversations with a college friend. The ballroom fell silent. Then came the whispers, the shocked gasps, the sound of chairs scraping as people stood to leave. Kellen tried to keep speaking, but his microphone had been cut. Security moved toward the control booth, but the damage was done. Every phone in the room was recording. The footage would be on social media within minutes. Moira sat frozen at her table, watching her lover's career implode in real time. By morning, Kellen Dorsey was unemployed. The hospital's board of directors had voted unanimously for his immediate termination, citing gross professional misconduct and potential legal liability. 3 patients had already contacted attorneys about the insurance fraud comments. But Elias wasn't finished. The beauty of systematic destruction was its cumulative effect. Each attack weakened the target's position, making them more vulnerable to the next assault. Kellen and Moira were now operating from a position of panic rather than control, which made them sloppy. On Friday afternoon, Moira came home early from work, her face drawn with stress and exhaustion. The past week had been a disaster. Caleb's business was ruined, Kellen was disgraced and unemployed, and the divorce papers she'd planned to serve were now meaningless since Kellen couldn't provide the financial security she'd been counting on. "We need to talk," she said, settling across from Elias at the kitchen table. "About what?" "About us. About our marriage." She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I know things have been difficult lately, but I think we can work through this." Elias almost laughed. After 16 years of marriage, she still thought he was stupid enough to be manipulated by a few kind words and fake concern. "Work through what?" "The problems we've been having, the distance between us. I know I've been working too much, staying out too late. I want to change that." "Change?" Elias repeated the word like he was tasting it. "You want to change?" "Yes. I want us to be a family again. For Rowan's sake, if nothing else." She reached across the table and touched his hand. Her skin was cold and he could feel the tremor in her fingers. She was scared. I think that's a wonderful idea, Elias said. Family is so important. Relief flickered across her face. She thought she'd won him back with a simple performance of remorse. There's just one thing I need to know, he continued. When exactly did you decide you wanted to kill me? The color drained from Moira's face. Her hand jerked back as if she'd touched something hot. What are you talking about? The valve in the boiler room. Someone rigged it to explode when I performed my routine inspection. Someone who knew my schedule, who understood the pressure systems, who wanted it to look like an accident. That's insane. Why would anyone want to hurt you? Insurance money. The house deed transfer, a clean start with your boyfriend. Elias pulled out the camera device he'd found in the basement. This was in our bedroom wall, recording everything. Tracking my movements, learning my patterns. Moira stared at the tiny lens, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. You tried to murder me, Moira. Your brother helped steal my house. Your boyfriend provided the motive and the method. The only thing you didn't count on was me surviving long enough to figure it out. She stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. You're having some kind of breakdown. The accident, the stress, it's affecting your judgment. Sit down. Something in his voice made her freeze. For the first time in their marriage, Elias Greenfield sounded dangerous. I said sit down. She sat. Now I'm going to explain what's going to happen next. You're going to listen, and you're not going to interrupt because your life depends on understanding every word. Moira's breathing was shallow, rapid. She was beginning to comprehend that her husband, her boring, predictable, easily manipulated husband, had somehow become something else entirely. First, the divorce papers you filed are going to disappear. Your lawyer is going to receive a very detailed report about your attempted fraud concerning the property transfer, along with evidence of your adultery and conspiracy to commit murder. He'll drop you as a client to avoid professional liability? Her eyes widened. How do you? Second, the house deed that Caleb fraudulently obtained is going to be reversed. I've already filed the paperwork showing that the transfer was completed without my knowledge or consent, using forged documents. Caleb is facing criminal charges and can't contest the claim. You can't prove. Third, your boyfriend Kellen is going to face additional charges for conspiracy and insurance fraud. I have recordings of him discussing the life insurance policy and your plans for my accident. The district attorney's office received those recordings this morning. Moira's face was white as paper. What do you want? I want you to understand that you lost. Completely. Utterly. You tried to play a game where the stakes were my life, and you lost. She was shaking now, tears beginning to form in her eyes. What happens to me? You're going to pack a bag and leave this house tonight. You're going to find somewhere else to live. Probably difficult since you have no money and no job prospects after the hospital learns about your involvement in Kellen's schemes. You can't throw me out. This is my home too. Actually, I can. The restraining order was approved this afternoon, based on credible threats to my safety. You have 2 hours to collect your personal belongings. He slid a legal document across the table. Official court seal, judge's signature, everything in order. Rowan is 16 years old and smart enough to choose which parent she wants to live with. The parent who tried to commit murder or the parent who prevented it. Moira stared at the restraining order, her hands trembling. This will destroy me. Yes, Elias agreed. It will. She looked up at him, searching for any trace of the man she'd married, the man she'd manipulated and betrayed and tried to kill. He was gone. Why aren't you having me arrested? Because prison would be merciful. This way, you get to live with the consequences of your choices every single day. No money, no job, no reputation, no family. Just the knowledge that you destroyed your own life through greed and stupidity. Moira stood slowly, defeated. She walked toward the stairs, then paused. I never meant for it to go this far. Yes, you did. She climbed the stairs without another word. 2 hours later, Elias watched through the front window as Moira loaded her suitcases into her car. She moved like a woman in a trance, mechanically going through the motions of leaving her life behind. Rowan came downstairs and stood beside him. Is she really gone? Yes. Good. His daughter's voice was cold, older than her 16 years. I heard what she did, what she tried to do to you. Elias put his arm around her shoulders. I'm sorry you had to learn that about your mother. I'm not. I'd rather know the truth than live with lies. They watched Moira's car disappear down the street, taillights fading into the Cleveland darkness. But Elias wasn't finished. There was still one loose end that required his personal attention. 3 days later, Kellen Dorsey sat alone in his downtown condo, surrounded by the wreckage of his former life. The hospital had fired him. His professional reputation was destroyed. The insurance fraud investigation was expanding, and criminal charges seemed inevitable. He'd been drinking since noon, trying to numb the reality of his situation. The silver BMW in his parking space would be repossessed by the end of the week. The condo would follow within the month. When the knock came at his door, Kellen assumed it was another process server or debt collector. Instead, he found Elias Greenfield standing in the hallway, looking calm and patient. Hello, Kellen. What the heck do you want? I want to talk. About my wife, about my house, about the creative ways you tried to kill me. Kellen tried to close the door, but Elias stepped forward, blocking it with his shoulder. We can do this here in the hallway where your neighbors can hear everything, or we can do it inside like civilized people. Your choice? Kellen stepped back, allowing Elias to enter. The condo was expensive but impersonal, the kind of place that looked like a hotel suite rather than a home. I don't know what you think you know. I know that you and Moira planned to kill me for the insurance money. I know you provided the technical expertise to rig the boiler explosion. I know you helped her falsify documents to steal my house. Kellen moved toward the kitchen, ostensibly to pour another drink. His hand inched toward the knife block on the counter. You're paranoid. Moira told me you've been acting strange since the accident. The accident you caused. Kellen's fingers closed around the handle of a carving knife. He spun around, slashing at Elias's face. Elias caught his wrist easily, applying pressure until Kellen dropped the weapon. Then he drove his knee into Kellen's stomach, doubling him over. 16 years of industrial work, Elias said conversationally. You learn to handle pressure. You learn to move fast when things get dangerous. You learn to fight. Kellen gasped for air, clutching his stomach. What do you want? I want you to understand something. You tried to kill me because you thought I was weak, stupid, easy to eliminate. Elias picked up the knife and tested its edge. You were wrong. I'll pay you. Whatever you want. I don't want your money. I want your confession. Elias pulled out a small digital recorder. You're going to tell me exactly how you planned my murder, who provided what assistance, how you intended to split the proceeds. Everything. And if I don't? Elias smiled, the same cold expression that had terrified Moira 3 days earlier. Then I'm going to spend the next hour demonstrating some of the things you learned, working with high-pressure steam systems. Did you know that a small steam leak can strip flesh from bone in seconds? Or that superheated water can blind someone permanently? Kellen looked at the knife in Elias's hand, then at the man holding it. This wasn't the boring maintenance worker he dismissed as irrelevant. This was someone who'd spent years working in dangerous conditions, someone who'd learned to be harder than the systems he repaired. You're insane. No, I'm methodical. There's a difference. Kellen began talking. The confession took 47 minutes. Kellen detailed everything: the insurance policy research, the surveillance camera installation, the boiler system sabotage, the backup plans if the first attempt failed. He implicated Moira as the primary planner and Caleb as the financial coordinator. By the time he finished, Kellen was sobbing. The arrogant corporate executive had dissolved into a broken man begging for mercy. What happens now? He whispered. Now you disappear. Leave Cleveland tonight. Don't contact Moira. Don't try to salvage your career. Don't attempt to return. Just vanish. And if I don't? Then this recording goes to the district attorney, along with evidence that you're planning to flee prosecution. You'll spend the next 20 years in federal prison. Kellen nodded frantically. I'll leave. Tonight. I swear. I know you will. Elias pocketed the recorder and headed for the door. Then he paused, looking back at the wreckage of a man cowering on expensive furniture. One more thing. The next time you decide to destroy someone's life, make sure they're actually destroyed. Because if they survive, they might decide to return the favor. He left Kellen alone with his terror and his rapidly diminishing future. 6 months later, Elias Greenfield sat on his front porch, watching the sunrise over Cleveland's industrial skyline. The house was quiet. Rowan had left for school, and he had the morning to himself before his shift at the factory. Moira had disappeared completely. Some said she'd moved to Florida. Others claimed she was working as a waitress in Columbus under a different name. Elias didn't care where she'd gone, as long as she stayed gone. Kellen had kept his word about leaving town. A private investigator confirmed he was working construction in Phoenix, living in a trailer park and drinking away what remained of his pride. Caleb was facing trial for fraud and conspiracy. His real estate empire had collapsed, and he'd lost everything: properties, business, reputation. The family that had tried to steal Elias's house had ended up homeless themselves. Justice, Elias reflected, had a certain poetic elegance when properly administered. His phone buzzed with a text from Theo. Coffee before work? Elias smiled. His friend had been the one person who'd supported him throughout the ordeal, never questioning the dramatic changes in Elias's circumstances or the convenient downfall of his enemies. Some things were better left unexplained. He walked to his truck, the legitimate one he'd purchased after selling Moira's expensive car, and drove toward the diner where he and Theo met most mornings. The routine was comforting after months of careful planning and systematic revenge. At the diner, Theo was already seated in their usual booth, coffee steaming in front of him. "You look relaxed," Theo observed, "like a man who's solved all his problems." "Most of them? What about the big one?" "The one that tried to kill you?" Elias thought about Moira, wherever she was, probably struggling to pay rent and wondering how her perfect plan had gone so wrong. He thought about Kellen, sweating through construction jobs and jumping at every unexpected sound. He thought about Caleb, preparing for a prison sentence that would destroy what remained of his life. That problem solved itself. Theo nodded, understanding. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting people live with the consequences of their choices. Something like that. They drank their coffee in comfortable silence. Two men who understood that some conversations didn't require words. Outside the diner windows, Cleveland was waking up. Trucks heading to construction sites, workers beginning another day of honest labor, the world continuing its slow rotation toward whatever came next. Elias had returned to his quiet life, but he was no longer the same man who'd been easily overlooked and casually betrayed. He'd learned that strength wasn't about size or aggression. It was about patience, preparation, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary when someone threatened your family. He'd also learned that sometimes the best way to destroy an enemy was simply to let them destroy themselves. "Ready for another day of keeping rich people warm?" Theo asked, finishing his coffee. "Always." They left the diner together, heading toward their trucks and another shift in the converted steel mill where Elias had once planned his revenge. The irony still amused him. Working in a building that had been transformed from one purpose to another, just like he had been transformed from victim to victor. As he drove toward the job site, Elias reflected on the lessons he'd learned. Trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. Love was conditional, marriage was a contract, and family loyalty was earned rather than assumed. But he'd also learned that intelligence and determination could overcome almost any disadvantage. That careful planning could defeat superior resources. That patience was the ultimate weapon when used correctly. Most importantly, he'd learned that he was capable of things he'd never imagined. Dark things, necessary things, things that had saved his life and preserved his daughter's future. The old Elias Greenfield had been a good man who trusted too easily and forgave too quickly. The new Elias Greenfield was still a good man, but he was also a dangerous one. And, in a world where people like Moira and Kellen existed, dangerous was exactly what he needed to be. At the job site, Elias parked his truck and gathered his tools. Another day of honest work lay ahead, maintaining the systems that kept the converted building functional. It was satisfying work, solving problems, preventing disasters, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. Just like he'd done with his personal life. He smiled as he entered the building, ready to begin another day. The furnace pact he'd made with himself was simple. Never again would he be the victim. Never again would he trust blindly. Never again would he allow someone to mistake his kindness for weakness. He'd learned to tend the fire that burned within him, keeping it controlled but always ready. Because in a world full of predators, the only way to survive was to become the most dangerous predator of all.